Radical.
Viewer discretion is advised.
Do you remember the reveal of the Xbox One? How much of a gigantic shit show that turned out to be? And afterwards, after the reveal, Don Matrick was asked about, what about players that don't have an internet connection? Seems like if you want this thing to be always online, always connected, what about the players that don't have an internet connection? And he said to them, we have a product for them. It's the Xbox 360. Sometimes these companies are pretty tone deaf when it comes to what the consumers want. Or maybe the Microsoft brand was riding high. 360 was a giant success for them. Xbox One, not so much. So now, flip this around, and Sony is clearly in control when it comes to Sony versus Microsoft. We're not including Nintendo in all this, but when it comes to Sony and Microsoft, Sony is clearly in that driver's seat when it comes to sales. Well, when that happens, when people buy a PlayStation 5, 2-1 over an Xbox Series X, they get a little cocky. And then what they do is they overprice things or price things a little higher than they probably should be, which is the case of the PlayStation 5 Pro. That was revealed to be $700 without the disk drive, without the stand. If you want the disk drive and the stand, well, you're going to have to pay $800 to $850, basically, including tax, but, close to $800. So why did I bring up Don Matrick in his statement? Well, there's a statement made by this guy was the senior principal product manager, Toshi Aoki. He stated to IGN, when they asked about the decision not to bundle a disk drive with the Pro, he said, with the PS5 Pro, we're offering all these new tech innovations, and we added the 2 terabyte SSD as well as the Wi-Fi 7, Aoki says. He adds, for the disk drive, it is an option for players. Not all players have disk, even though most players may, but we have the option for being able to add that for those players. So I think it's more of the balance of the value proposition that we're giving. Fucking value proposition. Listen, motherfucker, you don't get to price a system $700 bare bones without a disk drive and even mention that value proposition. Fuck that value proposition. You think it's a value proposition? Value proposition. Just the fact that they can't even admit that it's overpriced. There's a problem. They can't even admit that it's not a value proposition. It is clearly, for what it is, a wee bit overpriced. They're being greedy. Okay? They're being greedy. Plain and simple. So that's the problem right there. You can tell how cocky they are. They should have came out and said something, yes, it is a little more expensive, and we have the PlayStation 5, which is for the entry-level consumer or something like that, They could just say, for a more value proposition, we have the PlayStation 5, which still plays all the games. This is more like for those high-end users that want the highest level graphics. But don't even try to, tell people, oh, you know what? Oh, you can't afford it? What, it's a value proposition? It's a value. You can't afford this? What's wrong with you cheapskates? You can't afford $700-800? This is, during this economy, I might add, when people are just struggling to get food on the table and pay rent, you're overpricing this and saying it's a value proposition. But he said the option being able to add that for those players and saying not all players have disk, even though most players may. So if most of your players actually still have the disk, then to me it feels like it's kind of a tax on those players. Because if, let's say, a person got a PlayStation 5 at launch, paid $500 or, let's be honest here, close to $1,000 to get a PlayStation 5 at launch. I mean, not directly Sony's fault. It was just there was more of a demand than, could be kept up with at the time. But if you're a person that paid a good bit of money for a PlayStation 5 and you were intrigued by a PlayStation 5 Pro, then Sony, you have to put yourself into perspective of a person that actually paid for a PlayStation 5 and is considering getting the PlayStation 5 Pro. That's who you need to put into perspective of, right? To those people who are used to, even if most of what they download is digital, used to being able to go to get used PS5 games. Maybe they don't want to pay $70 for every fucking PS5 game. Maybe they want to go to places like yard sales or flea markets or mom and pop stores where they can get physical copies of games far less than they can digitally in many cases. That's the value proposition. There is no value proposition having a system that does not play used games. It does not play used games. Do you remember Sony with the PlayStation 4? Sony with the PlayStation 4, they touted, oh yes, this system can play used games. A decade later, this shit. So if you want to play used games and you want to actually save some money and not pay full price for every single game that you get and higher prices for the digital version, I'm sorry, some of you might tell me that, oh, there's sales, Rick, there's sales on the digital storefront. It's different, man. Being able to get a game for 10, 15 bucks when it's 20 to 30 somewhere. There's a lot of people out there that get a PlayStation 5 game, they get the physical disc, and they play all the way through, and then, they're like, okay, I want to move on to the next game. You have the option, sure. You have the option to get it. But the fact of the statement, I just cannot believe that. The balance of the value proposition. Man, if you want to basically have a statement that will not offend your consumer base, the people that you want buying a PlayStation 5 Pro, then come out and basically just tell them, even if it's maybe a fib, that you're really not making a lot of money on the PlayStation 5 Pro. I don't know the details of what it costs them to put the PlayStation 5 Pro together for them. For them, that would make, more money on software. Consoles used to be loss leaders, but let's say, they come out and they say and admit that it is a little pricey compared to what the PS4 Pro was. They could talk about inflation a bit. They can talk about how it costs more for them to put it together. And have somewhat of an apologetic tone at least. At least. But don't try to fucking tell people, like I said, that it's a value proposition when it's not a value proposition. There's no value there. It is a tax, like I said. Not including that drive in the box. One final thing I will say, and this is a suggestion to you, Toshi Aoki, or specifically Sony. Toshi's just a mouthpiece, but Sony. I'll say this directly to you. Not that you're listening, but you should listen, Sony. What you should have done if you wanted a value proposition is, number one, how about shave $100 off of that PS5 Pro? Have it be what most people thought it would be, $599.99. You could even have a $599.99 all digital version. And then you could have a $699.99 super version that has everything you really would want with it. The disk drive and the stand. Both of those things in there. And hell, maybe throw in like a game, maybe like maybe like, I don't know, like Last of Us 2. Funny thing is they're showing off The Last of Us 2, a PS4 game, so just throw in The Last of Us 2. I don't know, why not? Why not? Just like a code to get The Last of Us 2 or something if you want a value proposition. And have that bundle be $699.99. And then have a third option. How about this? This is my big suggestion. $599.99 without the 2 terabyte hard drive. How about a 1 terabyte hard drive? Just split it in half. and put on the disk drive. 1 terabyte hard drive, disk drive, and that's the third option. You want to give people value propositions? I think that one would probably sell the most. $599.99, less of a hard drive, but you have a disk drive. And then people would have the option later on to upgrade the hard drive, but that's seen as different because people can still use the hard drive, right? But the disk drive, like, it's a little bit different, right? Because out of the box, you have stacks of PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 5 games that you cannot play in this thing unless you get the optional hard drive. You can go and you can download these games, but I guarantee you're going to pay more in many cases for these PlayStation 4 and 5 games on Sony's marketplace than you would in places like swap meets, flea markets, yard sales, stuff like that. And people want to have value propositions. They want to have value choices. But that is such a fucked up statement that is just nice PR speech because, let's be honest here, Sony does not care about giving their user base, their PlayStation fan base, any value propositions. They're sending Toshi Aoki out to talk to IGN to damage control what is almost universally been a heavily criticized botch of a reveal of the PlayStation 5 Pro. You have almost universal from everyone online, from news outlets, from YouTubers, from the PlayStation player base. You have almost a universal calling out of Sony for their pricing of the PlayStation 5 Pro. If they really cared about their PlayStation player base, what they would do is they would roll back that price point by $100 on the PlayStation 5 Pro. That's what they would do. Or offer some SKUs like I mentioned. But since they won't do that, all this is a poor attempt at damage control that will not work.